All right, hi everybody. Okay, so I'm going to be doing my discussion. Today I'm talking about gender equity, specifically the article by Sadker called Gender Equity Still Knocking at the Class. I will say this was, hopefully all of you have read it. I definitely suggest actually reading it. It was a pretty good article to read. It was definitely really interesting, and it was written in 1999, so I know um, I think there's even been quite a few changes since this article, but it was still interesting to kind of read about some of the issues that we still have going on today that were happening in 1999 too. So I'm just gonna kind of go through basically what the article was talking about. The author made 10 points that I'm gonna just kind of briefly summarize all of those points and what those points mean for the classroom and gender equity in the classroom. And then at the end, I have a couple questions that I will pose to you guys, and I'll also write them on the discussion board that I'd like you guys to kind of provide your feedback with so we can discuss together. Okay, so if I can get my PowerPoint removed. There we go. Okay, so the author begins the article by first kind of just talking about, is gender equity really a problem? And of course, yes, it is. But the big problem with it is that it is so hard to convince people that this problem exists. And why is it so hard to convince people of this problem? So he talks about a couple things. So about why it's so difficult to convince people of gender equity issues. The first of those things being gender blindness. So he actually described a scenario that in which he uses when training students on gender equity, in which he shows them a video that contains some sort of gender bias scenario. And oftentimes, teachers are actually not able to identify the bias that's happening in that video. And then he proceeds after the video, to provide them training about identifying biases and confronting gender biases in the classroom. And then he re-shows them the video, and like at that moment, then they're able to see like, wow, there are actually, all of these biases going on that I didn't even see prior to kind of somebody pointing them out to me and that they occur. So I think that's a really interesting and really important point that a lot of times people just, they really are gender blind. They just don't see the inequities that occur really all the time, and even in, just kind of minor and nuanced kind of scenarios and discussions and actions that happen in the classroom, that a lot of people just don't see and realize are really some sort of gender stereotype or biasy happening. And then the second thing is, which I definitely think we experience a lot, and even this was written in 1999, so we can imagine 2017, this problem is kind of even multiplied, but it's just this false sense of accomplishment that all of us have. So, it seems like, of course, we have really truly made great strides in gender equity and equality, in our culture and our society as a whole, but then also definitely in the classroom. And it makes us feel like we've accomplished so much. And while that is true, it's also not that true because we still have so much further to go. And if we still think about gender equity in the grand scheme of things, it's sometimes kind of crazy just to imagine that we still aren't actually treating all of our students equally in the classroom. So those are a couple things he discusses about, why um, that gender equity is definitely a problem, but then what makes the problem even greater is that it's very hard to convince people and have people see this problem. So he then goes in to talk about 10 kind of cases of gender inequity that are occurring right now, and how pervasive it is in the classroom. So that is what I'm going to talk about next. So he kind of does it in descending order. So we'll start with number 10, move to number 1. So first of all is the fact that segregation still thrives in U.S. schools. So this, of course, is a huge problem. We see this in gender equity but also race inequities. But basically, the idea is that although tax supported schools, so any school receiving tax funding, they're legally required to, not discriminate against females or any other gender minority. We still see segregation occurring in the majors, in the courses that students choose to take, in careers, and then even emphases within career fields. So, for example, for school majors, of course, we know about the STEM gap in the representation of minority students in STEM fields, so particularly women, people of color, students from low socioeconomic statuses, and so on and so forth. We know that that's a big problem and a big gap in STEM fields and majors and so on, and then also in certain careers. So we still find that women are kind of choosing to cluster in a lot of kind of careers that are more traditional to the female gender role and so on. And then also even emphases within career fields. So we even find that if a woman kind of goes into a more male dominated career field like the medical field or maybe law, they're still likely to take on a more traditional female um, role in that field. So, for example, if they're going to be in the medical field, it's more likely that they're going to be a nurse instead of a doctor. So, I have this little graph here from an interesting article by Wei, Levinsky, and Benbow, which was written in 2009. And it was written about visuospatial reasoning. But if you can kind of see it, we can see actually at the top bar graph are STEM degrees and STEM occupations, and then the bottom bar graph are visual arts degrees and visual arts occupations. And what you'll see is obviously in the top bar graph with the STEM is, of course, we see way less females represented in that group. But what's really interesting below that in the visual arts occupations is we see, a lot more females represented in this group. But what that light gray bar at the top means is that those are actually the females that are performing at the top 1% of their classes. So they have the highest visuospatial reasoning, the highest, achievement and academic grades and so on and so forth. So these are the females that are, very high achieving, very bright, have a lot of potential, and we still see them going into visual arts careers instead of STEM careers. So that's just an interesting article if you ever want to read it and look it up. It just kind of shows us a little bit more evidence for the big gender gap that we see in STEM representation. So next, number 9, we have the fact that public schools are now creating single gender classes in schools. So this is interesting to read a little bit about. He just touches briefly on it. I think it'd be interesting to read more on. This isn't something that I have thought about and read as much about. So I think this is interesting, but he definitely talked about how, there is current research looking into creating single gender classrooms and how that actually will benefit female or male students more than like a co-ed classroom. And he was just saying that, kind of all of the time and energy and effort that researchers are putting into researching that single gender classroom, we could also be investing it in just improving the co-ed classroom already as it is, because it just doesn't really seem necessary. So I think that was interesting. Definitely maybe something to read up more on for myself. So number 8 was gender-related safety and health concerns, which continue to plague females. So this is just an interesting quote that he included from something. I don't actually believe he put the year, but obviously this was, quite some time ago. But he said that doctors warned that education redirected blood initially destined for the ovaries to the brain. The result, educated women would be less likely to reproduce and more likely to go insane, which I think it's just always interesting to kind of read some history and see where we've come from. Luckily, we have come a long way from that, but it is just sometimes crazy to imagine that that was ever, the kind of dominant way of thought. But then more importantly, just what's happening right now, we do know that 20% of school-age girls report being physically or sexually abused, and 80% of girls report experiencing some form of sexual harassment. I believe these numbers are actually, this paper was in 1999, so I believe these numbers are even bigger now, but something that we also do know about the reporting of physical and sexual abuse is that it is way underreported. So even the numbers that we do have are, they're projected to be, way less than what that actual number is. So that's something that's really important. And I actually have, on the right side of the screen, I have two kind of charts of the United States. So this was actually about the vote on the Violence Against Women Act, which is a really important and interesting kind of regulation in the classroom, especially on college and higher ed campuses, which just protects students who experience violence, helps to provide them with resources for overcoming any trauma that they received, and then also gives them resources for going to court and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting bill and act that was passed. And if you don't know much about it, I definitely suggest researching it. But what's interesting to me is this is actually the 2013 vote to pass this act. And you can actually see on the top, kind of graph of the United States, all of those dark red areas are actually votes no against this act. So again, this act just protects students who have been the victims of physical and sexual abuse, which kind of just seems inherently like something we should have, and yet we still see so much pushback from politicians and from government to not allow these kind of regulations to be pushed through. So I definitely think that's an important issue. And then number 7, the dropout rate is now what we think it is. So he included this statistic, which I had never heard before, but this is just pretty crazy and very pervasive to me. But evidently in 1995, it was found that 1/3 of Hispanic females between 16 and 24 had not completed school or passed a high school equivalency test. I think it'd be really interesting to see what this number is now, but 1/3 is really, really, really large of the part of that population. So definitely a problem there. Number 6, for girls, gifted programs are often early in and early out. I think this is another interesting part that I kind of wish I knew a little bit more on, but I bet my gifted and creative ed people would be able to speak to this a little bit, and I'd be really interested to hear some more on this, but stuff that was included in the article, the author was mentioning that by 10th grade, girls are dropping out at a higher rate than boys dropping out of gifted programs, and that gifted programs often reinforce gender segregation. And then number 5, of course, is that gender bias also affects males, which is, something that I think sometimes, we forget about, and it's really important, to also consider those biases that affect males. So what was included in the article, 3/4 of boys report that they have been the target of sexual harassment, such as jokes, taunts, and teasing. The percentage of men teaching in elementary is greatly smaller today than it was when Title IX came out, which was over 25 years ago. And of course, men are often subject to biases when they don't fit into the typical male gender role. And number 4, classroom interactions between teachers and students put males in the spotlight and relegate females to the sidelines. So stuff that was mentioned is teachers unconsciously make males the center of instruction. They also reward male students for improving their behavior, but don't reward female students for consistently maintaining good behavior. So teachers are very commonly rewarding, a male student if he's behaving really poorly, and then his, behavior is modified and he starts to, behave more constructively. The teacher is really likely to reward that, Whereas a female student who may have been behaving positively and well the entire class